So thanks for inviting me to come up to talk about some of my work. It's not directly health-related per se, but it is something that is probably intersects health in a number of different ways. So I'm going to talk about some of my work on sea level rise and migration, and it's almost entirely in the United States, though obviously sea level rise is something that would be much more global as well. So to do this, to talk about migration in the U.S. in the context of sea level rise, you really have to do two things. You have to model or think about how many people are at risk to sea level rise, which would be the magnitude of migrants, and then you kind of have to figure out where people are likely to go on top of that, which would be the migration framework. I like to use a plumbing analogy in that the magnitude of flows is the water flowing through the system, and the migration framework is the pipes that kind of takes that water places. To really understand what sea level rise could do, we have to be able to do both. So I'll talk about both of those aspects. If you want a really quick primer on sea level rise in about 35 seconds, sea levels have risen by about 8 inches since 1900. So while it's sort of perspective in the way we talk about it as being in the future, it's also something that's already occurring and has occurred. And the predictions for sea level rise range for, right now, essentially between 1 and 2 meters by 2100. And the multi-centennial projections suggest upwards of 7 meters by 2300. This is from the most recent NOAA report from 2017. And you can see there's already the historic trend inside of here. And then these are the different curves that they've developed, upwards of 2.5 meters and 8 feet. I'm only going to talk about 6 feet, or 1.8 meters, just under 2, because when I started doing this work, 6 feet was considered the highest high, and that was only 3 years ago. Now the highest high is over 8 feet, and in some cases is upwards of 10 feet by 2100. So all of the recent physical modeling seems to suggest elevated amounts of sea level rise by 2100, more aggressive curves as opposed to less curves. And I'll show a little bit of results, I think I will, with 1 foot, just because at the time 1 foot was still possible, but it seems to be increasingly unlikely. So how many people are at risk in the U.S.? This is a very simple way to do this. You simply raise the water level, and then everyone who's under that new water level, that the threshold would be at risk of migrating. It's very simple. The problem comes in that these curves are all way out into 2100 as opposed to today. And so we call it population dynamics as opposed to population statics. And so we have to incorporate this sort of population change in our coastal communities to really understand how many people would be at risk. So if we look at the different curves between 3 feet, which would be 0.9, a more conservative estimate of sea level rise, versus 6 feet, which would be the blue, you can see that for the U.S. by 2100, it could displace upwards of 13 million people in coastal communities across the country. And this is on the map. You can see it's sort of everywhere. Every coastal community has a little bit because they are exposed to sea level rise by virtue of being a coastal community. But there's a lot of concentration in Louisiana, in South Florida, in many of the major metro areas as well, in San Francisco Bay Area in particular. Yeah, so 13 million is a lot of people. And you can see it sort of really gets aggressive by the end of the century. Now, I'm not the first person to do this kind of work. People have been doing this since at least 1980 as well to try and figure out how many people. But again, they're using current populations, and coastal communities are still some of the most rapidly growing areas in the United States. And the difference between the current versus the projected numbers essentially is a doubling, that coastal communities will see twice as many people at risk by the end of the century than there are currently in coastal areas would be threatened today. And you can see as well that of that 13 million number, it's a super localized effect where almost half are Florida residents, followed by Louisiana and then California. Louisiana, with about 1.5 million people that would be displaced, doesn't have nearly the populous coastline that California has, so there's a bit of differences in relative risk as well. Pennsylvania is in there. It's way over here, though. It's not nearly as threatened as some of the other states. Now, timing matters on this. When sort of this will occur is differential depending upon the area, and it also depends upon how much sea level rise we have. Here's just 4 sample numbers. This includes the 1-foot results. We had a reviewer that didn't like them because of a technical reason around vertical elevation thresholds. But I've got Charleston County, which just got nailed by Dorian, Miami-Dade, which avoided Dorian, San Mateo, which is just outside of San Francisco or in the Bay Area, and Monroe County, Florida, which is the Florida Keys. And if you look, the profile for the risk or the displacement is very different for all of these communities. In the case of Charleston, it has a really nice fan pattern, if you will. Looks very much like the national. Miami-Dade, on the other hand, the difference between 3 feet and 6 feet is essentially an order of magnitude. So 6 feet of sea level rise is really bad in Miami. 3 feet is bad, but it's not as bad. In San Mateo, you can see that there's an overlap between the 3 feet and 6 feet curves. And if you look at Monroe, you'll notice it sort of starts to plane out on the 6-foot curve, the blue. This is because essentially the Florida Keys run out of people that could be displaced by the end of the century. We published extended results for everywhere, and I want to highlight a couple areas. In particular, these are the counties where over 2/3 of the population would be essentially underwater every day by 2100. And you can see some of these are pretty small. Tyrrell County and Hyde County, North Carolina, again, they got walloped by Dorian, are pretty rural, but they are extremely exposed to sea level rise. I don't know another way of describing Tyrrell, Monroe, and Hyde County as having catastrophic impacts from it, where over 80% of their populations essentially would be displaced. And I want to point out further down as well, Broward County and Miami-Dade, while their relative risk is much lower, right? We think of these as being right in the center, right? The canary in the coal mine in terms of sea level rise risk. But the numeric amounts are very large. They're 1 and 2 in terms of the rankings of the magnitude of the risk. So 1 out of every 4 people that could be displaced by the end of the century would be in Miami-Dade or Broward County. So just sort of exactly what I just said about the catastrophic impacts, there's 6 counties with over 100,000 people that would be impacted with less than 3 feet, and 31 counties with 100,000 with 1.8 meters or 6 feet of sea level rise. So there's 190 counties or something like that in the analysis that we did. So it's a hyper-localized. Miami-Dade and Broward counties were 1 in every 4 persons that were impacted. And when we published this paper, there was a lot of discussions around managed retreat. And the U.S. didn't and there continues to be some, but there weren't a lot of examples at the time when we were under review in 2015 and published in 2016. And the estimates at the time for the few that existed in the U.S. suggested a managed retreat of around $1 million per person, which seems very crazy expensive. And if you combine the $1 million per person with the 13 million estimates on the high end, you could see if we wanted to buy everybody out from coastal communities, could cost upwards of $15 trillion. Now, if you go, well, I don't think coastal communities are going to grow and continue to grow. I don't buy that argument. People are going to be a bit smarter than that. So instead of 15 trillion, you end up with 7.5 trillion. And if you say, well, $1 million is a lot of money, there's no way we're going to pay $1 million. And in fact, a year later, there was a study that came out that suggested the average managed retreat was closer to $200,000 per resident. Okay, so instead of $7 trillion, it's like $1.5 trillion. Any way you kind of slice it, if we were to buy out people from every coastal community, it would be exceedingly expensive. Now, the thing about sea level rise is it's sort of, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it on a map, because the exposure to sea level rise is not always your proximity to the coast. This is Miami-Dade and Broward counties down here, and the blue is all the areas that would flood. I'm particularly fond of Weston, which is right there, which is actually 17 miles from the beach. And there are areas in between that are actually not exposed to sea level rise, which is very counterintuitive. And if you want to see what it looks like, what 3 feet of sea level rise would be, this is the storm surge from Hurricane Irma. a number of years ago, and this was essentially what downtown Miami would look like every day. So where will they go is the next question. If we end up with 13 million migrants, this would be on par with what we call the Great Migration of Southerners, rural African Americans, and whites out of the South into the industrialized North, places like Philadelphia. The question becomes, where will these people go? And so I used IRS data to try and forecast where the destinations would actually be, the origins and destinations. I like to show this because this shows 3 counties in particular: Assumption Parish, Louisiana; Dougherty County, Georgia, which is the city, the wonderful city of Albany; and Eagle County, Colorado. Because sometimes the results seem kind of counterintuitive as to where people will go. I just want to point out that there are, for whatever reason, there are people moving from Miami-Dade County to Albany, Georgia. I don't know exactly why. Or from Assumption Parish, Louisiana to, I think that's Buffalo. Is that Buffalo? I don't know why, but there are people that are doing that because this is 2013. So when you take all these sort of migration systems, you project them forward as well, and you flood these pipes with 13 million people, this is the ultimate result of where people go. Now, this is a complicated figure, but I'll try and walk you through it really fast. This is arranged clockwise based upon the size, the number of in-migrants into a state. So right here we have Florida. So Florida has the most number of in-migrants. They're also colored based upon the top 10 sending areas. So Florida is colored, it's blue, so these are the blue flows from Florida. So it's a sending, it's a top 10, it's a number 1 receiving, it's a top 10 sending. All of the top sending and all the top receiving states are also sending states except for one, which would be Georgia, which is down over here. And then you can see the different movements of people. Now this is confusing to try and interpret, so we can just look at the net change or the net migration due to 6 feet of sea level rise without adaptation. And you can see Texas could receive 1.5 million migrants. Florida could lose about 2.5 million. Now, Florida had 6 million people at risk, so most of those are relocating within the state, which is what you would expect from climate migration to be largely short distance. People end up pretty much all over the place. This is where all of the destinations are, and you can see on the left would be counties, I believe. Yes, left is counties, right is metropolitan areas, and you can see places like Orlando immediately pop out as being dark blue, same with Austin. The Philly area, right, this is Philly up here, I believe, right? Yeah, it's blue, but not as blue as D.C. Atlanta is another one as well, whereas dark red being South Florida and so on. Now, people can probably adapt in place, and so I did run a migration or an adaptation scenario as well. It doesn't change the tails of the distribution, if you will. It doesn't change. Austin is still the top destination, followed by Orlando. And Miami is still the largest loser of population, where people will move out of in both scenarios. But it does change. It does change the middle of the distribution, where some areas adaptation measures can actually be very protective or change the sign, if you will. Now, this is all in the future, and I want to emphasize too that sea level rise is happening already. This is a major problem in a number of coastal areas. These are what they call sunny day flood events that happen. The term that I really like that they use is nuisance flooding. Like this is some sort of just a little nuisance that we'll all get over. And this is not rainfall driven. This is tidal driven. This is just a high tide, what they call a king tide if you're familiar. And my personal favorite is the guy over here with his garbage can. He probably just thinks this is a big nuisance. This is also salt water. And these are very recent. This one on the right is the city of Brunswick, which is in coastal Georgia. This one on the bottom left is also coastal Georgia. That's the city of Tybee Island. And the one in the middle is Miami. And people are coping with it. I really like this New York Times or Washington Post headline about Norfolk, about a church. I don't know many churches that have to put the tide chart on their website so people know whether they can go to church. So some people will adapt in place, some people won't. Retreat is very contentious and expensive, averaging $200,000 a person. We can accommodate, just build upwards as well. This is also very expensive. If you want to Raise the first floor elevation, it costs about $194,000 on average in the U.S., and protection, of course, is also very expensive. We can build seawalls, but it costs, the estimates are $92 billion a year. Thank you.